Our second reading comes from Luke chapter 5, verses 17 to 26. Jesus forgives and heals a paralyzed man. One day Jesus was teaching, and Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there. They had come from every village of Galilee, from Judea and Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was with Jesus to heal the sick. Some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat and tried to take him back into the house to lay him before Jesus. When they could not find a way to do this because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles in the middle of the crowd, right in front of Jesus. When Jesus saw their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." The Pharisees and the teachers of the law began thinking to themselves, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus knew what they were thinking and asked, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts?" Which is easier to say, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Get up and walk." But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the paralyzed man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." Immediately he stood up in front of them, took what he had been lying on, and went home praising God. Everyone was amazed and gave praise to God. They were filled with awe and said, "We have seen remarkable things today."
Thank you, Daniel and Marketta. There are many stories of Jesus healing in the Gospels. St. Luke, particularly as a doctor, includes many stories of healing and often points to physical healing as a sign of who Jesus was, and also as a visible sign of the deeper healing that very often happened in people's lives as a result of their encounter with him. I think this one is probably my favourite healing story. I wonder which yours would be. I like the drama of the story and the touch of comedy, I imagine, as they began to lower the man through the roof. I like too the sense of community and strong friendship there must have been amongst this group, so determined to get their friend to Jesus. I like the fact that there is holistic healing, the physical healing that you see and the deeper healing that comes through forgiveness. I have to admit that I also like the showdown with the religious leaders. Puffed up in their own importance, they had got the best seats close to Jesus. They had in no way come to receive healing from him, but rather to try and suss him out, even perhaps to trip him up. This story comes quite early in Luke's Gospel, around the time of the calling of the first disciples, and already Jesus' reputation was beginning to spread. In the passage before, we read how crowds were beginning to follow Jesus, such that he had to withdraw to deserted places to pray. And then on this day, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law arrive. Let's imagine the scene. We're in Galilee, in Capernaum, according to Mark's Gospel, so maybe at Peter's house, who knows? Certainly we're indoors. These religious leaders are there, seated close to Jesus, and Luke makes a point of the fact that they have come from all of the villages in Galilee and from Judea and from Jerusalem. They weren't just local. That must surely have been quite unusual. Jesus must have been causing quite a stir for them to bother to come along to this small Galilean village to hear him. Were they invited, or had they just assumed a right because of who they were? Jesus is teaching. I'd love to know what he was saying to them. And then he's interrupted by these four friends bringing the paralysed man. Luke specifies that the friends were men, but it is not clear in Mark's Gospel. And interestingly, in the TV series The Chosen that I've been watching on YouTube recently, the lead friend in this scene is played by an African woman, which challenged for me some of the stereotypes that I carry. If you haven't seen The Chosen, you might want to take a look at it. It's a TV drama in episodes that have been crowd-funded. It uses a lot of dramatic license. It fills in the backstory and lots of details that are not in the Bible, but it is also true to what is there. It's good for making you think what it might have been like to be around Jesus. And it's given me pause for thought and sent me back to the Bible sometimes to see what it actually does say. So that's no bad thing. Anyway, I digress. I think that the first awareness anyone would have had at the arrival of these friends was when the roof began to fall in. Made of straw and clay and wood, and sometimes with roof tiles on the top, you can imagine little bits beginning to fall through, followed by bigger bits, perhaps startling the teachers of the law to jump up out of their seats as larger chunks began to fall. I wonder what the homeowner thought. Fortunately, it was probably fairly easy to repair, and I only hope that the friends stayed on afterwards to lend a hand. And so the hole is made and the man is lowered down. How was he feeling, I wonder? Being paralysed must leave you with a sense of helplessness that would have lived with him through all his life. John Ortberg, who's an American church leader and author, makes the point that it was perhaps surprising that he even had friends. He would have been totally dependent on others for all his physical needs. It was no state benefit or NHS to turn to. And in that culture, disability was frowned on and seen as a punishment from God. Perhaps that's why it was important for him to first hear from Jesus, "Your sins are forgiven," before the physical healing can come. As I said earlier, healing is not just physical. We're interrelated beings. Mental illness such as stress and depression and anxiety can lead to physical symptoms, and also physical symptoms can lead to those conditions of stress. We can't disentangle them. We are holistic beings. And within all of that, I include spiritual well-being too, finding peace with God, with one another, and being at peace with ourselves. Anyway, this poor man must have felt completely vulnerable as he was lowered down through that roof. Presumably his friends had asked him and he'd given his permission for this to happen, but he was making a very dramatic and uninvited entrance into the midst of people who were not going to welcome him. Perhaps he could see their frosty glare and disapproving looks. And what reception was he going to get from Jesus? He was interrupting this rabbi in the middle of teaching. It seems that at first Jesus wasn't focused on him, but rather on the friends looking in through the roof, because it's when he sees their faith that he then addresses the man. "Friend, your sins are forgiven." And it's then that the muttering begins. Who is this who's speaking blasphemies? Who can forgive sins except God alone? Well, yes. But you know, I don't think that that's the point Jesus was particularly wanting to make at this point. I don't think he would have expected them to be open to the thought that he might be God. And anyway, I'm not sure that that's what was really upsetting them. To claim to be God would perhaps just seem ridiculous. And so I wonder whether what was upsetting them more was that Jesus was claiming to speak on behalf of God, declaring God's forgiveness of sins and therefore undermining them and the whole Jewish temple tradition. Sins were declared forgiven by priests at the temple after ritual sacrifice was offered. And Jesus appeared to be bypassing all of that. And I think that would have been the greater threat to them at this point. And he goes on to prove that he has authority to do so by effecting a physical healing, which had presumably been the focus of most people's attention. Sometimes, though, the visible physical need is not what somebody wants healing. There can be deeper things than that, and those involved in prayer ministry are always told not to assume. I love the fact that in other stories Jesus often asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" Here, instead, he turns to the teachers and says, which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, which may just be empty words, there's no visible proof to be had, or stand up, take your mat and walk. Now that's measurable. And so a double miracle occurs. Not only is the man's paralysis healed, but also his muscles, which must have been very weak at least, were strengthened enough for him to immediately begin to walk. I told you this was my favourite healing story, and actually it was part of my journey towards becoming a pastoral assistant, which was my first authorised role within the Church of England many years ago now. I wanted to be like the friends, playing my part in carrying the mat and bringing people to Jesus. And that's a central part of my calling still today. I want to bring people to Jesus. But there are two things that I've come to recognise along the way. Firstly, I have a mat too. Sometimes I need to be carried and allow myself to be in that vulnerable place where I admit that I need healing too. That's all part of being in Christian community, that sometimes we carry the mat for others and sometimes we are on that mat ourselves. Secondly, things don't always turn out as I would like. However determined I might be, however much I might pour out love and commitment and time, however hard I pray, sometimes the people don't get better in the way that I would want. Now, for one thing, I can't bring people to Jesus if they don't want to come. But also sometimes God's healing comes in a different way to what I would like. And I have to accept that simply being alongside someone and carrying them in prayer to Jesus is all that I can do. And then the healing is up to him. And so we're going to either listen to or sing along with the beautiful hymn, "Christ is the world in which we move." It talks about bringing people to Jesus as a touching place for healing. We may not at the moment be able to engage in touch of one another physically. It'd be wonderful to be able to hug again, wouldn't it? But in prayer, we can bring people to that place.